Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining our conversation with Jonathan Mosen, tech guru, CEO, entrepreneur, you name it, he's done it all. He's joining us live from New Zealand, out of all places. We're incredibly grateful that he woke up early this morning to join us.
Great. Looks like we have a steady stream of people signing on to the webinar. So I think we'll give people a minute or two to get in, and then we'll kick it off.
Fantastic. If people are interested in any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. There is a comment box, a chat feature. We won't really be using the chat feature today. Sorry, it is 1 p.m. Eastern. But if you do have any questions for myself or Jonathan, you're welcome to drop them in the Q&A bot, and we'll try our best to get to them.
All right. All right, let's get started. Let's see here. So first off, thank you everybody for joining us today. We are very thrilled to have you joining our speaker series. And my name is Alicia Smith. I'm the Associate Director for Career Launch at Perkins School for the Blind. Career Launch is an innovative training and career services program helping blind and visually impaired young adults land career track jobs. During today's webinar, like Brian mentioned, we will be using the Q&A feature. So please, at any time, feel free to drop a question into the Q&A box. We will reserve the questions to the end, and we'll try to get through all of your questions, either live, or I can also type responses if I happen to know the answer. But if I don't, we will bring those up for Brian and Jonathan. So we're so thrilled today to welcome Jonathan Mosen. He is a podcaster, radio host, and assistive technology guru. Throughout our speaker series, we showcase people who have visual disabilities who have led exemplary lives in work and in their personal lives. These people who we feature, including Jonathan today, are extraordinary role models for not only our Career Launch participants, but also, of course, our students at Perkins School for the Blind, and indeed for us all. With that, I would now turn things over to my colleague, Brian Switzer, who will be in conversation with Jonathan today. Brian is the training and program specialist for Career Launch. Brian, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'm super excited to have Jonathan Mosen here with us today, all the way from New Zealand. I saw that we have some participants from Ecuador, which is amazing. I'm so excited that there's so many people from around the world joining us. If you guys don't know who Jonathan Mosen is, he is the CEO of the Woodbridge organization in New Zealand, a vocational organization for people with disability, as well as the founder of Mosen Consulting. He is also the podcaster, the host of the Mosen at Large podcast, a huge international podcast with thousands of listeners, focusing on everything visual impairment and blindness related. He's the one that facilitates the zeitgeist in the blindness community. He's really a wonderful spokesperson for the blindness community. That podcast can be found on Mushroom FM or Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. Today, we're going to be talking about advocacy, asset technology, or assistive technology, depending on what part of the world you live in, as well as entrepreneurship and managing and working while blind or visually impaired. And Jonathan is a 10-time over expert in a lot of these things. So I'm absolutely delighted to have him here. My first question for you, Jonathan, is how did you get started in radio broadcasting?
Well, hi, Brian. Hi, everybody. And thanks also to Alicia for helping us out here and for the very generous introduction. Actually, I got started in radio really early because I was this precocious kid of about 4 who liked 2 things a lot, the telephone and the radio. And so when you like both of those things a lot, a really good thing to do is to start calling into talk radio stations as soon as your parents teach you how to dial a phone. And it literally was a dial back then. And so I would start calling into this talkback radio station and just, I don't know what really I was talking about at the age of 4, but they thought that was pretty fun. And we got a telegram. This is the era of telegrams. And one day the telegram came and it was asking one of my parents to call the manager of the radio station. And my parents had this big argument about this because they wondered, whether the manager was going to tell them to make sure that their little brat of a kid ceased and desist calling the radio show. So finally, my dad got the short straw and he phoned the manager of the radio station. And actually, what they wanted to know was, would I go into the radio station and co-host a Christmas show? And that started my involvement in radio. So that was a long time ago. And I think it's next year I will be coming up to my 50th anniversary of being on the radio. So that's actually how I got started. I literally grew up on the radio.
Wow, that's just incredible to think. Your skills have carried forward from the time of over-the-air radio to internet radio to podcasting. Even now, a lot of the participants that we have come through our program, a lot of them are interested in going into radio broadcasting or podcasting. What skill would someone have to possess to be really good at radio broadcasting?
I suppose radio broadcasting is quite a big area, but one of the things that I think it all has in common if you're in front of a mic is the ability to communicate. And I think the relationship that a broadcaster has with their audience is quite a unique and special one because hopefully, if you're fortunate enough, you might be reaching thousands of people like Mosen at Large does. But when you do, whether it be a podcast or a morning drive show or whatever it is, the relationship is quite intimate between you and the one person who invites you into their home or into their car or on the subway with you or wherever they happen to be. So it's a personal relationship with thousands of people. That's actually quite tricky to pull off. So I think you have to be a good communicator. These days, you also have to have reasonably good computer skills, I think, as well, because most radio stations use extensive computer systems. So that's important as well. I also think with a lot of these sorts of high profile roles, being a blind person, you also just need to be a good self-advocate and to be self-confident and to be resilient. There are going to be setbacks. And I certainly had those quite early in my career where if I hadn't been quite as resilient, I may not have ever worked in commercial radio because so many people told me a blind person couldn't do that. So a bit of tenacity doesn't go amiss.
Yeah, that's really incredible. I know from my own experience, I feel like having listened to your podcast, the Mosen at Large one and the one prior to that for many years, I definitely feel like I know you pretty well, even though that's probably the first time we're at least speaking to each other. So good on you for building those intimate relationships. Speaking of resilience, you faced early on in your careers a lot of barriers to being able to be a radio broadcaster. And as a result, you started your own station called Radio Enterprise. Am I getting that right?
That's right. Yep.
Uh, and so what kind of attitudinal, and so Radio Enterprise is a section of all blind or visually impaired people who ran the entire gambit. What kind of attitudinal barrier did you face when you started in radio broadcasting?
Well, a good example of this was that a friend of mine, knew that I was really interested in radio and that I might have a bit of ability in that regard. And they saw this ad in the newspaper that said, there's a broadcasting course coming up and we're looking for people with some broadcasting talent. And what we want you to do is submit an audition tape and we're going to choose the best people and put you through this course and connect you with all these important contacts in radio. So I thought, wow, that's a cool idea. So I put my tape together and I sent the tape in. And about a week after that, I got a phone call from the manager of the course. And he said, that tape is fantastic. We want you to do the course. And then he told me the price. And I was a penniless student at the time. And I said, look, I'd like to do the course. I just can't afford that. I'm sorry. So we ended the call, but he called me back about an hour later and he said, look, you are so good. We think you've got a future in radio. We'll give you the course for half price because we actually think it's good for our course to say that you graduated from it because you're going places, kid. And so I thought, okay, I'll do it for half price. So I said to him, okay, so what I'll do is the day before the course starts, I need to go in and put some Braille labels on things and just get familiar with the equipment and stuff. He said, what are you talking about? And I could feel like this massive attitude adjustment over the phone. And I said to him, well, I'm blind, and so it'll be fine. I'll just get familiar with the gear, put Braille labels on things that need Braille labels, and we'll be good. And he said, oh, look, you're wasting my time. There's no point in a blind person doing this course because there's no way a blind person could work in radio. Well, the interesting thing is, by the way, as a postscript to that, I didn't do the course. And about a few years later, 4 or 5 years later, I actually became his boss on a radio station that we were both working on by that point. But what I realized was that one of the biggest problems that we often face as blind people is other people's attitudes. So what can we do about that? I mean, we can lament it and we can get grumpy about it, and I get all of that. But I realized really early on that we need to create our own opportunities sometimes. So I did set up this radio station because I was determined to have a career in radio. And in the 1980s in New Zealand, when I did this, you used to have to go through enormous bureaucracy to set up even a temporary radio station, which is what this was. You had to apply to this tribunal, I guess a bit like the FCC. You had to prove that you could be on the air responsibly. I used my Apple IIe with Braille Edit to write that whole application, and we sold advertising. We operated it as a successful commercial venture. So that was the first part of the plan. But the second fiendish part of the plot was, once I had this temporary radio station going, I called everybody in the industry that I could think of, broadcasters, managers, program directors, everybody in radio I could think of. And I said, come out to the School for the Blind and see a bunch of blind people doing radio. And a lot of them did. A lot of people came out. So the reason why I did that was, by the time I was ready to get into radio myself full time, I knew everybody because I'd established those networks and I took the initiative to build those relationships so that they were there for me when I was looking for work. And it actually wasn't that difficult to find it in the end.
That is just so incredible. My partner thinks I'm strong-headed for a running marathon that no one else who's blind or visually impaired have run before. I can't imagine spending years starting a company and building from the ground up, and just the incredible influence you might have had on the people that you invited to come and see the radio station. In the year 2022, information is more widely disseminated. We have social media, we have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we have YouTube. If you want to know how someone who's visually impaired, uses a computer or walk down the street with a guide dog, it's all at your fingertips. Do you feel like attitudinal barrier, people's attitude towards visual impairment or blindness have changed over the years?
I like to hope so. I like to think the needle is moving a bit. And you're absolutely right about all the technology we have access to. So in the 1980s, when I was thinking about these things, we didn't have the internet. It was even before I was on the old bulletin boards. And so I was constantly told here that a blind person couldn't do this. And maybe one or two people would tell me about a blind person they'd heard of in some other country that maybe was doing this, but it was hard to reach them. These days, with initiatives like yours and other things like AFB Career Connect and various things like that, or just doing a bit of a Google search, you can find other people who are doing the thing that you want to do. And that is incredibly empowering because everybody's journey is going to be unique, but there are commonalities in terms of some of the challenges that you may want to overcome. And even if you can find an older mentor who's trodden this path and done something that you're interested in doing, it gives you hope. It gives you knowledge that it's possible. So the internet has made an amazing contribution, I think, to our sense of confidence and seeking information.
Yeah, definitely. And I know it's a smaller world than it used to be. You used to be the only blind or visually impaired person in your town or city. And now that while that still might be true, you're able to connect with hundreds or thousands, in your case, of people with visual impairments across the world. That community is so small and tight knit now.
Yes, it's a special thing. I'm obviously really quite honored that we've built this community around the podcast like Mosen at Large, and it's a responsibility as well. But it's great, it's one of the things that got me starting ACB Radio in conjunction with the American Council of the Blind in the late 1990s was this idea that as radio broadcasting on the internet became possible, it really became clear to me that radio is all about community. And typically, we think about radio in terms of our local community. Perhaps it's not so much the case now as it was earlier, but your local radio station could tell you about events that were going on near you and that mattered to you, even just reading the local weather. But when you look at something like the blind community, it's spread out across the globe, but a lot of our challenges and information that we're seeking are similar no matter where in the world we are. And so internet radio and later podcasting allowed new communities to form that are global rather than geographical in scope.
Yeah, definitely. And I like that you touched on advocacy, that we have similar issues no matter where in the world we're located. And so we can all come together and advocate for similar things no matter where we reside. I did have a quick question. You have started your own business. You manage teams of hundreds of people, especially in your current role as CEO of Woodbridge. What advice would you give for someone who's blind or visually impaired and applying for a job?
A couple of things. I think one of the really difficult things for any human, but I think particularly for any disabled person who is bombarded with so many negative messages about what they can and can't achieve, is being an objective critic or critique of your current capabilities. So when you're thinking about the role that you want, it's also important to think about what are the barriers that I may be able to control that could be in my way of getting that role. Now, some of those barriers we've talked about, they're attitudinal and they can be quite difficult and they can be fatiguing. But if those barriers are things like your knowledge, then those are things directly in your control. So Workbridge is actually an employment agency. We spend a lot of time with disabled people in New Zealand, helping them to get work. One of the things that I say to people is, if you are looking for work, that's your full-time job. And what I personally think works is you divide your day in half. In the first half of the day, when you're fresh and you're not so, I guess, downtrodden by what's going on in life, you tackle the job sites, the career sites. You look for jobs that may suit you, and you write those application letters. But in the other part of the day, you think about upskilling. For example, if you are a JAWS user, and the reality is that most of the world's computers in offices are still Windows-based, and many applications are proprietary and require scripting to really allow you to be efficient. So chances are, if you have vocational aspirations, it is important to be a JAWS user. Then JAWS has a lot of free training available that you can use to upskill your Microsoft Office capabilities, or other tools that you might want to use in the workplace, so that you can be competent and hit the ground running. So I think as long as you're doing those things to take positive steps and feeling like you're not being overwhelmed by events, that's important. So being objective about where you might fall short, how you can improve where you fall short, that's really important. And I think the other thing I would say is, the one job you are most certainly not going to get is the one that you don't apply for. So it's important not to give up. It can, it may not seem like it, but I actually have been through periods of unemployment. It's demoralizing. It's really upsetting when you feel like no one's willing to give you a fair chance. And there's no doubt that vision impairment complicates the job search. But if we give up, we're certain that we won't get anywhere.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of us go through periods of unemployment, and it's definitely very frustrating. We've all been on the interviews where we feel like we're being judged on the basis of our visual impairment. Do you have any advice for people who are going through the interviewing process, how they can come across as using their visual impairment as a strength rather than a weakness?
Yeah, front-footed, absolutely front-footed. So I think with legislation like the ADA in the United States, and we have a Human Rights Act here in New Zealand, employers are a little bit nervous about getting into trouble with that legislation. So sometimes they don't ask the questions. If they don't ask the questions, they make assumptions, and often those assumptions are totally wrong. So I think it is important to go in there, and if it doesn't come up and the interview's starting to wind up, or you feel like it's just not gaining momentum, this interview that you're in, it's up to you to say, look, it's quite reasonable that you might have some questions about how I, as a blind or vision impaired person, would do this role. Would you mind if I talk to you about the technology I use and how I've done similar roles in the past? And this is one of the frustrating things, I think, is that no matter how many roles you have done, often people think, well, you may have done these other roles and goodness knows how you've done them, but you couldn't possibly work in our workplace. I used to get this when I was in radio all the time. If I was going to a new radio station, and because of how crazy the radio market was when I was working in it, I was moving up and down the dial quite a bit. It was always the operations manager who was worried about a blind person being let loose on their equipment, who would raise the objections and say, you can't possibly operate our gear, you're blind and you'll break it. And so I just learned that I have to front foot that. I have to put them at their ease. And I understand why it can feel frustrating that you have to feel like you're proving yourself over and over again. But, I'd rather go through that process and get the job than lose a good job.
I totally agree. I like to, when I interview for roles, I make sure that people are well aware of my visual impairment, as well as how I'm able to do things up front. And whoever that hiring manager is, they're ultimately responsible for making sure that you're able to do your job and that work get done. So you can understand why they have questions, and for better or worse, New Zealand and the U.S. had the ADA. Those legislation make it even more complicated for a manager to ask those kind of questions. So being proactive, letting them know how you're able to do things, and letting them that the door is open to ask more questions if they should arise, can definitely put a manager at ease.
Yeah.
If you had a magic wand, what kind of assistive technology would you like to see in the world?
Right. Well, I'll have my self-driving car right now. That's the easy one. that would just make such a difference. I'd love my self-driving car. I was thinking about what technology would I really like that I don't have? I think I'd love to reimagine screen reading someday. At the moment, the screen reader experience for a speech and a Braille user is quite linear. So one thing that you really notice when you work with sighted people is that they can just glance at the screen that contains a lot of information. And if there's something that's standing out or something like that, they can immediately just filter and get the information. So I guess I would like to see screen reading move in future to some sort of artificial intelligence model where you could almost ask questions of your screen reader, have a conversation with it about the information that you are seeking. So that would be good. I think one of the things that has surprised me is how long it is taking for the personal assistant technology like Siri and the Amazon thing and Google to really be impactful beyond the kind of gimmicky things of asking trivia questions or getting the weather or playing radio stations. I thought, given that Siri was first announced 11 years ago, that by now we would be at a point where we could say, book me a flight from Boston to New York next Tuesday, and I want to leave sometime in the late morning. And it would just do that. It'd come up with a bunch of options and say, yeah, I've found this one on Delta. It's whatever the price is. You want it? And you could say yes. It would have your credit card info and do it. So a tedious transaction that takes quite a while, particularly with a screen reader, should be doable in just a few seconds, and it's not. And I'm surprised. I guess it just goes to show how complex processing human speech actually is. And there are probably some privacy ramifications of that too. But those are a few ideas that I'd like to see. But just get that car to me. That's what I want.
Definitely. Yeah, and it poses a lot of challenges for people with hearing loss. Me myself, I have significant hearing loss, and so my speech is not always the clearest. So with the my A lady, I had changed her name to make it a little easier to pronounce for myself. And yeah, I definitely would love to see that technology come further along. I love my A-Lady and other devices that beep back to me. But I totally agree. They don't seem to do a lot. They can turn on my lights, which is pretty cool, but not much beyond that.
Yeah, and the way you can shop from Amazon is perhaps an example of what should be possible more widely, because the Amazon shopping experience with it is pretty cool. But you bring up a whole different product category that I had overlooked, which was remiss of me because I also wear hearing aids and I have a significant hearing impairment. And one of the technologies I always look at is new hearing aid technology and how good it is at filtering background noise and how good it is at filtering in echoey locations where a bit of acoustical bounce can make it difficult to hear. Google's got some very amazing algorithms. I've heard them working, but they're not, to the best of my knowledge, in hearing aids yet, where they can really isolate a speaker. I mean, you can be in a crowd and you can isolate one single individual, and that's all you hear with some of the stuff that Google is working on. So eventually that will filter through to hearing aid technology, and I think that's going to be quite exciting.
That's incredible. I'm not aware of the technology, but I think that could be life-changing for a lot of people. I know for myself, I've been a hearing aid wearer since the age of 2, and the technology has really come a long ways from even when I was a kid. Even 5 years ago, I purchased a new pair of hearing aids, and I could hear behind myself for the first time because the old school hearing aid didn't have any microphone behind you, because why would you want to hear behind you?
One of the most frustrating experiences was when I was doing a lot of travel when I was working for HumanWare and Freedom Scientific and IRA, and I was doing a lot of international travel. And you would stay at these big hotels with these massive elevator banks, and you'd push the button and the elevator would go ping. And as a hearing aid user, you would have no idea where the ping came from. You can hear the ping, but you rapidly trying to find which door has just opened before it closes again. And like you, I got a new set of hearing aids 3 years ago now. And for the first time, I could tell where the ping was coming from. And just little things like that were just, a game changer. You don't dread going to the elevator anymore.
Yeah, it's really incredible how hearing aid technology is really designed for people with vision versus people like you and I who are blind or visually impaired. And I really give a lot of credit to my audiologist for understanding that and adjusting my programs appropriately so that I can hear more of the background noise and a little less of people's speech. But when I'm traveling independently with my guide dog, a lot more important for me to understand where sounds are coming from and what sounds I'm listening to.
Yeah. Outside my family, my relationship with my audiologist is the most important relationship in my life. And it's just so important to find an audiologist who understands this. And the thing is, I am the world's best and worst audiology patient. I'm the worst because I just want to keep pushing this technology to the max. But I'm the best because I know about audio and I can talk in terms of, take up by about 3 dB, the frequencies at 8 kilohertz and stuff like that. And audiologists love that stuff. But yeah, that is so important. And what has frustrated me is it's been quite difficult, even though I'm a pretty pushy kind of dude. It's really difficult to get a relationship with the audiology companies, with the actual hearing aid manufacturers, because a lot of them come from Europe, Denmark and Switzerland, places like that. And so even if you have a good relationship with your local representatives of the company, they are not the product managers. They are not the people who decide what goes into a product. And so often you find, for example, remote streamers and that kind of thing, where they have these push buttons that give you no tactile indication about when something's on and when something's off. That would be easily fixable if we could get to these people, but it's really difficult to get to them.
Yeah, and I've had similar experiences. My hearing aid come with an app, and I absolutely love applications and how user-friendly they are. A lot of times with VoiceOver, they work great. But the hearing aid company I have, their application, it should really designed not to be used with a screen reader.
Yeah.
I've sent several emails and never heard back, unfortunately. So I would really love for them to connect with people who are blind or visually impaired and really advance the technology forward.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's good to geek out on this, Brian. I could talk about hearing aid technology forever. Yeah.
We should have warned people up front that we're going to be geeking out on hearing aid technology, but maybe we should return to how can someone in the workplace support someone who's blind or visually impaired if they have a colleague or an employee who's visually impaired?
I think there are two questions that many of us would just like our colleagues to ask. Basically, what do you need and how can I help? Because so often people make assumptions. And I was at a workplace once, and I won't name it, but I expected a little better of this workplace. But as it happened, when I arrived there, I found myself being quite mollycoddled. It was important for me to cross a street on a pretty regular basis, and it was not that busy a street, but people were very worried about me doing this and everything. So in the end, I went to the boss and I said, next time we have a all hands meeting, would you just give me 10 minutes or so to talk about my life as a blind person and how I do what I do, how I travel independently, and what my needs are. And I did it in a very non-confrontational way, in a kind of a slightly humorous, informative way. But the problem went away after that because it was just that people understood. And again, I realize this isn't easy for everybody who find it difficult to get up and speak for yourself. And it does feel like you have to keep explaining yourself over and over again. But I suppose, it's the hand that we are dealt. And I look at it as an investment in what turned out to be a lot of really quality working relationships.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's really frustrating that this information not as freely available to people as you would think. There's a lot of us do travel safely, whether with a cane and with a guide dog. So you'd think people would know that by now, 2022.
Yeah, you would.
What do you see as the biggest employment barrier for people who are blind or visually impaired in your role as the CEO of Woodbridge?
Definitely attitude. So we spend a lot of time, and Workbridge is a 90-year-old organization. So Workbridge has spent a lot of time making sure that people with a wide range of impairments are as job ready as possible. But in recent years, what I've been asking us also to focus on is, you can have the best product in the world, but if people ain't buying that product, what's the point? And so you've got to create a market that's more conducive to disabled people being hired. And for that to happen, you have to patiently take employers on a journey. And it's a journey that says that disabled people are not a health and safety risk. They're not expensive to accommodate. They're not somehow less productive. What they are, in fact, they tend to be loyal, capable people who can bring new ways of thinking to the workplace that benefit everybody. So dealing with those attitudinal barriers is a huge issue. And as a result, I've started a subsidiary at Workbridge called Just Say Yes. And Just Say Yes is specifically aimed at providing courses and information and an answer line that employers can call to deal with all those nagging doubts, the how will they questions. So we're trying to tackle this from the employer side as well, and just patiently explain that if you are overlooking hiring a disabled person, you're actually overlooking potentially your next big employment rock star.
Wow, I just love that helpline that's available to employers. That sounds like a wonderful initiative. Maybe that's something we could export to Career Launch. We'll make sure you get all the credit, though. I think that would be a wonderful resource for employers. Yeah, I've heard the average cost of accommodations to be, somewhere between $200 or $500, somewhere in that neighborhood. And yet, when onboarding, the typical average cost for onboarding a new employee is in the range of $40,000. So we're really talking about a drop in the bucket when it comes to paying for accommodations.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And it's an investment too, because certainly with things like the Great Resignation and the hot labor market right now, unemployment is low in most Western countries. It is here too. Really, if you accommodate an employer who's willing to reward your loyalty by being loyal to you, it's a win-win situation. So that accommodation is an investment.
Yeah, certainly. It really showed that you really want that person to be productive as optimally as they can be and produce the work that you're hoping for. Is there anything else someone should know about working with someone who's blind or visually impaired?
Well, obviously, I think the culture of a workplace is really important in terms of making sure that material is accessible and that tools are accessible. At my workplace, I instituted a 100% accessibility policy. And what that means is that nothing we procure, nothing we produce is anything but as accessible as it can possibly be. So we've thrown out our old payroll system, for example, our leave management system, because it wasn't accessible, and we got a more accessible one. We've done a whole lot of things like that in terms of procurement of our IT. We encourage all our staff to keep the accessibility checker running in Microsoft Office so that they do always produce accessible documents. If they don't, we gently correct them and make it clear where that's gone wrong. So I think that that's just good practice. The trick is so in my situation, first I'm the chief executive, but second we're in the disability space in the organization that I lead. But if you're the only blind employee, the trick is to effect those changes without making it seem to you like you're causing all this inconvenience And that there is a bit of a knack to that. I think accessibility is just the right thing. And when we produce accessible documents, we all benefit. And that's the way to pitch it, rather than saying, oh, we have to produce everything accessibly because we've got Brian here now.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. And there are probably more people with visual impairment in your workplace than you realize. People who wear glasses that need the font be a little bit larger. There are people with hidden disabilities. Unfortunately, when you're the only one that comes into a workplace with a guide dog or a cane, it definitely feel isolating, like you're the only one with a disability in that workplace. And statistically speaking, that probably not true. Almost a quarter of people have some kind of disability, even if it's not something that they're openly talking about.
Yeah, and this is the journey that we've been on at Workbridge as well, is that we're encouraging positive disclosure. And what we found was, in the past, people were a bit reluctant to talk about impairments that they might have in case it disadvantaged them. And now what we're saying is, well, look, we're disability led. I'm really proud of the fact that our board chair and our council president, and of course our chief executive, we're all disabled people, which is just fantastic. So we're walking the talk, and being disabled is actually a positive thing. It's something you can be proud of. It's something that we're all too willing to accommodate. And the thing about us, of course, is because we are an employment agency for disabled people, if we aren't really exceptional at this stuff and welcoming and accessible and accommodating, when we go out and talk to employers about this, we're hypocrites, and we can't be hypocrites. So we've got to get it right.
I absolutely love that you're leading by example, and walking the walk as well as talking the talk. That's just incredible. We do have about 20 minutes left. I did want to open it up for questions from anyone in the audience that may have questions for Jonathan or myself. Alicia, do we happen to have any questions?
We do happen to have a few questions.
Oh boy.
Buckle up. So call to anybody out there who'd like to drop a question in the Q&A box. We will be going through questions, so please go ahead and type something in. So our first question comes, this seems like a bit of a technical question, comes from a attendee joining us from Uganda. Welcome. They ask, how do you use computer systems on the radio? Screen reader, I imagine that wouldn't work easily, or Braille displays.
Okay, well, the way that this would work is, a Braille display is ideal if you are a Braille reader. I will say that Braille has been absolutely critical in my career, because it has meant over the years that when I was working in radio full time, somebody can put a breaking news story or a script in front of me and I can read it. One of my most memorable commercial radio moments was being on the air when the first Iraq war broke out. And, it would have been terrible if, because I wasn't a Braille reader, I would have had to not be on the air at that point because of all the breaking news coming in. So Braille is important. But what you do is you just have a separate audio device on the broadcast computer that your screen reader can talk through. And that audio device will be coming through the mixer at the radio station in pre-fade. You're right, Alicia, this is a very technical question. It can be coming through the mixer in pre-fade or on another bus, so that you can hear your screen reader's speech, but the listeners can't. So it is absolutely possible to have a screen reader on the same computer. The one thing that the ops people can get a bit nervous about is if they believe that the screen reader will make the broadcast computer less stable. And so you have to be really careful about what you install, what components you use, but it's definitely doable. Last weekend, for example, we put together an 11.5-hour marathon of an event raising money for blind Ukrainians and those who have left Ukraine and are now refugees. And that was done using this method. And we didn't have one single technical glitch for that whole 11.5-hour live event. So it's definitely doable.
That's great to know. I know the Apple iPhone employed similar technology, which is a assistive technology in teacher. It's really frustrating because I'm not getting the audio from their screen reader when I'm on the phone with them.
Yeah.
But it is really great technology.
Yes. Yeah.
Alicia, do we have another question?
We sure do. Let's see, we have somebody who, let's see, has a website and a YouTube channel and is finding that podcasting is a lot easier and more efficient for them than creating videos on YouTube. So this person is asking if you know about any good tutorials or resources on podcasting from a blindness perspective.
As it happens, I do, because I created one.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah. As Brian has mentioned, I think in the intro, I was running a company called Mosen Consulting, and during the Mosen Consulting days, I was doing a lot of different things, including government relations work and training, working with app designers, but we also produced some ebooks and audio tutorials. As technology marches on, so when the technology becomes has moved on and the tutorial has become obsolete, I pull them. But there are still a few tutorials left on the mosen.org website. One of them is called Unleash Your Inner Podcast, and it is a audio guide. I can't remember how long it is, but it is actually fairly lengthy, that talks about the basics of how to produce a good podcast. What I would also recommend is a lot of people are working, be they musicians or broadcasters or podcasters, with a multi-track environment called Reaper. That's R-E-A-P-E-R. And the reason why people are choosing this is, first, it's incredibly reasonably priced. It's just $60 to purchase a license. But also there's an incredible community of blind developers who are making Reaper work exceptionally well with a range of screen readers, including NVDA, which was actually originally developed for this tool, and JAWS, and even Narrator that is built into Windows. So in addition to the podcasting tutorial, which you can get from mosen.org, Brian Hartgen has recently produced a tutorial called Reaping the Benefits, which teaches you how to use Reaper for projects like podcasting. And if you go to his website at Hartgen, HARTGEN.org, you will find his tutorial called Reaping the Benefits, and it's really good. So with the combination of those two things, you should be in good shape, technically at least, to produce a podcast.
That's great to know. I know you've created a lot of resources over the years, not just with Mosen Consulting, but with IRA as well. Your trainings are still up for anyone to use around IRA. What do you see in the future for visual interpreter, like the one that IRA uses, versus Vision AI? Do you see Vision AI replacing visual interpreters?
When I was at IRA, we looked at this. For those who aren't aware, I was the Vice President of Explorer Communications for a while at IRA. And we were doing a lot of work on it at the time. What we concluded was there are so many people using IRA that we had a lot of data points about some of the struggles that we face every day and the things that we want assistance with, and that could feed in to AI. I think we will get there over time. And probably the best example right now that I can think of is the Envision glasses, which are really intriguing, and they seem to be continuing to evolve. But I think for the foreseeable future, there's just something so handy about having a conversation with a human, especially the way that IRA does it, where you've got a dashboard that shows your GPS location. It can show other information stored in your profile, all sorts of things like that. And you can just ask specific questions and get specific answers. I think it'll be some time until AI catches up with that model.
I absolutely love what IRA is doing. I use it all the time when traveling through airports and calling up Uber and Lyft. It's a wonderful tool. One thing I'm really excited about is I do I with the self-driving car technology, I heard recently that their camera can see better at night than even typically sighted people. So I'm excited that AI technology could even be more responsive in different environment than the typical human eye could, and that could be really exciting for those of us who are blind or visually impaired. I did see a
Yeah.
question from Marlene in the chat, and she said when she's interviewing, how can she get people to notice her versus her cane, and see past her as someone who's blind or visually impaired?
Yeah. See, that's interesting because often it's the guide dog handlers that have that question because people want to pat the dog and ask questions about the dog. I suppose it's again coming back to those things that we talked about earlier about really encouraging the employer rather to view you as a viable candidate. And so I think it's just confronting the issue. But when I say confronting it, I don't necessarily mean in an aggressive way, but just raising the issue. I think if you can demonstrate that you're relaxed about your vision impairment, that tends to set the tone. And if you show that you're totally cool, you're happy to talk about it, they don't need to be on eggshells about it, that can change the mood. Sometimes, though, it is true that some people you just can't shift, and that's quite demoralizing.
Yeah, definitely. My advice would be have open conversations with people. The more you get to know people, the less it is for them to see you only as a book cover. They have to read through your pages and get to know you a little bit more. Alicia, do we have any more questions?
We do have a couple more. One question is asking if you have any tips for somebody who's heading out into their first job, where maybe they are the first person who's blind to work at that company. And so the assumption is that most colleagues aren't familiar with working with or being around people who are blind. So they're specifically asking around social integration and kind of settling into the role, the soft skills.
That's an interesting question, and I don't know whether I have some stock tips, if you will, because I think sometimes you have to read the mood of the company that you're in. I've walked into organizations where I felt that my blindness really just wasn't a big deal, and maybe people had a few questions or I needed to correct a couple of misassumptions or something, but it wasn't really a big deal. And then, as I mentioned, I've been in other places where they want to kind of wrap me up in cotton wool. And so I think the first thing is for every blind or low vision employee who goes into the situation to try and go in with an open mind. If we go into the situation with a bit of a chip on our shoulder and we're making an assumption that, oh, they're going to shun me or treat me differently because I'm blind, you're almost setting yourself up for those expectations, and you may see offense or a problem where no offense or problem was actually intended. So one's own mindset is really important. But the second thing is, if you do find that you are confronting some things which is making it difficult to do your job or to socialize, if you're able, I personally would try and see if you can raise it in a constructive way, say at a staff meeting or at some sort of forum, and do it in a positive way. The one thing, I mean, the last resort, I think, from my perspective, would be to get someone external in. If I know that not everybody can advocate for themselves, and it can be really upsetting and demoralizing. So if you have to get somebody external in, then by all means do it. But I think one of the dangers of doing that is that it makes you seem even more special and unable to sort your own stuff out. So see what you can do for yourself first before you perhaps resort to somebody coming in and doing a bit of advocacy for you.
That's wonderful advice. Alicia, do we have any more questions?
I do have one more for now. So this person is joining us from Southeast Asia, and they state that in their region, disability awareness is at best invisible. And this person has never felt comfortable disclosing their disability because to this day, They don't know how to make themselves legible in the sociocultural spaces. And so they're referencing a podcast of Mosen at Large that happened recently, where you pointed out that as a disabled person, you shouldn't just not request an accommodation simply because you're worried about being perceived as inconvenient. So they're wondering about advice for somebody who's working in this context of how to navigate a situation where they need to make a case for accommodations that may not have an immediate benefit to the client.
Yeah, and I think it would be really presumptuous of me to comment on other cultural factors that might be at play. I have done a little bit of work in some Southeast Asian countries, and I know exactly what this correspondent is talking about. And as a Westerner coming into that environment, I had to be very careful to be assertive without being offensive. It's a really tricky one. So I think in that environment, there's a much more rudimentary thing that might need to happen, and that is simply awareness raising outside of an individual's workplace, but perhaps having a discussion as a society about what role do we as a society expect disabled people to have. And one individual can't do that, but this is where collectivism can really help. If there is an association of blind or vision impaired people or disabled people that can perhaps go to government and other institutions of change and initiate that sort of conversation, I think that this kind of issue, when you're dealing with the whole culture of a nation, is well beyond an individual situation in the workplace. It's actually about having a conversation about changing expectations.
Yeah, I think education can be really key here, making them aware of what kind of place in society people with disabilities have in other cultures and parts of the world. I know I've been really shocked when I was younger to find out how different cultures treat people with disabilities, for sure. I did have one final question for you, and it revolves around Braille. There's a lot of really cool Braille technology coming out. There's the Braille watch, different kinds of screen readers and Braille ads. Where do you see the technology for Braille going?
Well, I'm very positive about Braille with an uppercase B. I remember in the 1980s when computers really started to talk properly, and a lot of people said this is going to be the end of Braille. And in fact, it's so cool to see some really innovative things happening in the Braille space. So the next big one that we have to crack is this holy grail of multi-line Braille displays that can not only display multiple lines of text, but also graphics as well. I think that's very important to ensure that more blind and low vision people get involved in STEM subjects and disciplines. And it looks like APH and a company called DOT feel like they're on the verge of actually making this viable. And I'm very excited about that. I'd love to see more people get involved in the sciences. So multi-line Braille, continuing to make it cheaper. One of the things I'm proudest of in my career in assistive technology is that I oversaw 2 separate 40% drops in the prices of refreshable Braille devices in my career. It's still way too expensive, and I'd like to get Braille in the hands of more people. So if we can find technology that replaces the good old piezoelectric cells that's cheap but still feels like Braille and isn't too noisy, then that will be exciting as well. So there are still some things to do with Braille. The other thing, of course, too, is making sure that everyone who needs it gets instruction in Braille, good quality Braille instruction.
I totally agree. I'm really excited to see what the future of Braille brings. I'm glad to see new technologies emerging. As a former high school math teacher, I absolutely love the thought that someone could easily pull up a chart or a graph and feel it with their fingertips. I think that would be incredible technology.
Yeah.
I did want to let everyone know today's International Guide Dog Awareness Day. As a guide dog user myself, I did want to shout out Intrigue, my guide dog, or as my daughter calls her, E. She doesn't know her letters yet, but she knows E for intrigue. So I did want to leave on that note. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming and speaking with us. Thank you to everyone who came out and attended. If you wish to learn more about Jonathan Mosen, don't forget to check out the podcast, Mosen at Large. And I'm sure he'd be open to any feedback for information. You can read the Career Launch program at careerlaunch@perkins.org. If you're interested, this summer we will be running tech boot camps around the Google Suite and the Microsoft Suite, as well as the full program will be starting at the end of August. You can find out more if you wish. You can inquire at careerlaunch@perkins.org. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon or morning if you're in New Zealand. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. It was a delight.